Welcome to What? Last week we talked about some attitudes to rules and regulations. Paul continues to give us an alternative to being snowed under by the rules of our culture. Look at this. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Since we are now Christians, think about Jesus things, basically says. It appears here, Paul is saying, think about the heaven type of stuff. That's a good idea because it takes us out of our process of thoughts that we're often locked into and what is happening around the world. Yet this passage is about living and living a spiritual life in a physical world, and that's not an easy concept sometimes to come to grips with. But Paul gives us principles. It says, think about Jesus. Think about who he is, where he is, basically dwell on him. In old terms, meditate on Jesus. Meditation gets a bit of a negative rap from Christians these days because of the focus of meditation from other religions. But meditation in a biblical concept is focusing on God. And in the next verse, the concept is repeated. Verse 2, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. In other words, think about it. Here is the thing with thinking, you need to actually do it. By that I mean, you need to focus your thoughts. Listen to what God said to Joshua thousands of years before what we've read. Joshua 1:8. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. In other words, sink time into it. The next verse is a bit different though. Verse 3 says, for you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. The concept here of dying is a finalizing or a finishing things. You have finalized and finished and dealt with the things that were talked about previously in the chapter, like rules and regulations of this world, and even the expectations of this world. That has been left behind, and now our lives are wrapped up in Jesus, if you want to put it that way. Verse 4 says, when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Paul's idea is that when we are focused on Jesus, we'll be in a permanent relationship with him. Now, it mentions here Jesus' glory. That's not only a future concept, but a present concept, because we worship and we glorify Jesus now. Glory isn't about the future, but us glorifying Jesus is part of our present life as well. And that's why we are told to put to death or get rid of whatever stops us glorifying Jesus. And notice what's on the list in verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Kind of sounds like a list written about today's society. Why these things are mentioned and not some other things that we would assume would be there, like lying or swearing. And the reason is because these are the base level. The 5 sins which belonged to their pagan past are associated with their earthly nature. Paul practically identifies these members with the sins committed by them as he describes the first outward expressions of sin and sexual immorality, and then inward cravings of the heart, ruthless greed. The danger of greed is especially emphasized as a gross sin, for it was equated with idolatry. Such a person, instead of focusing on his or her whole life on things above, where Christ rules as king, is seeking the things below, and therefore worships and serves the creature rather than the creator. But why are we told to stop it? Well, verse 6 tells us, it's really blunt. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. Because God doesn't like that stuff. It's pretty basic, isn't it? These things hurt people, both the person who commits the sin and those the sin is directed at. It is not part of God's plan. So Paul is saying, God says stop. And that is how you used to live. So stop living like that, and now live how God wants you to live. Listen to verse 7. You used to walk in these ways, in the life you once lived. You get the point? That's back there. You used to do it. And Paul is saying God wants you to live without these things as part of your life. And Paul extends the list in verse 8 and 9. But you must also rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other. These are ones which I suppose that we would say are the little sins, or the smaller sins, or sometimes the sins that others don't see, or the sins we can justify. Getting angry as well, we can justify that if somebody makes us mad, or doesn't come up to what we expect. It seems to be okay with our society to slander someone or have a go at people. Just look at what politicians do and say. Swearing is nearly a national art form, and lying is treated okay as long as you don't get caught. Well, sorry about this, but they rank as sins. God doesn't like them, and keeping them as part of our lifestyle is not part of the plan. In fact, as Christians, we have to eradicate them from our lives, and we try to, but they're often the little bits that we just allow to get in. And we think that they don't matter too much, and that's just rubbish. Listen up. It says in the second half of verse 9, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. If we call ourselves Christians, it means we want to be like Christ. I mean, that's where the name comes from, Christ. And the word in the end, the Ian part, is one who is like. So it's Christian. The old stuff is gone. Being like Christ is the aim. But notice here the word renewed. Notice also the word before it, being. We are in the process of being renewed. When I read this, I thought it was like being renovated, kind of like on the block on television. You know, the old building is made into something special. Yep, that's the idea. And notice it's a process. So you don't beat yourself up too much about it if you ain't there yet. Allow the process to happen, and notice that the process is aimed at doing. It is aimed towards us being the image of God. Yep, we are to become more like God. And that's a big thought. Paul then talks on a funny little trip back to the last chapter. And he says, here there is neither Gentile or Jew or circumcised or uncircumcised or barbarian or Scythian or save or flee, but Christ is all and in all. Last chapter it talked about not judging people, and here it is again. This time it's about not judging because of race and nationality, which for the early Christians was a tough call, because the Jews thought they were the best and the most spiritual. The Romans thought that they were the best because they were winning wars and such. The Greeks thought they had all the best brains. And hey, every race and nationality has its own prejudices, including us. We like to beat the Poms at cricket and the Kiwis at union. Well, that doesn't happen very often. And we'll just beat anybody at soccer that we can. And we assume we should win. But what it is all about here is that there is no discrimination, no pecking order, no hierarchy because of race or nationality. When it comes to knowing God, it literally is all about Jesus.